Hello and welcome to this third Mythconceptions video where we address common misconceptions, misunderstandings, partial errors and so on linked to our English curriculum. Now today we're focusing on this question around the Birlings and social class in terms of an inspector calls. Now today's misconception is quite a widespread one, and it's to do with this basic idea that the Birlings are an upper class family. So we can look at the case for why people think that, look at some ideas around Edwardian ideas and views of class or understanding of the class system, and why that is in fact either wrong or only partially correct. So why is it that some people think that the Birlings are an upper class family? Well, one of the key things early on we see immediately through the stage direction is to do with their wealth and their lifestyle. They live in this fairly large suburban house. The furniture is described as heavily comfortable, quite impressive. They've got servants. There's Edna, the parlour maid. There's also all these signs of luxury on the stage when the curtain first comes up. We see the champagne glasses being cleared away and the dessert plates. On the table, it's been replaced by port, a cigar box and cigarettes. There's the clothing they're all wearing as well. They are dressed in a way that makes them look like they're going out for this posh dinner or celebrating, as they are in their house. The men are wearing towels and white ties, so very, very well dressed in terms of the time. And we are told quite clearly this is the house of a prosperous manufacturer. So Mr. Birling is, of course, a factory owner. We have got this idea also of the signs of their social position. So Birling several times brings up this idea of being Lord Mayor. I was Lord Mayor here 2 years ago, he says. He talks about still being a magistrate, and Mrs. Birling brings that up too. And he also brings up a couple of times this idea of there being a chance of a knighthood. So he's obviously someone who is socially climbing the ladder, very aware of it, and building these connections. We also see Mrs. Birling's snobbery. Her sense of social superiority, that she and her family are better than other people. And there's two lovely phrases when she talks about Eva Smith, girls of that class and a girl of that sort, and the judgment we get from her. There's also the way that Eric and Sheila behave. So these are very clearly two children who've been raised with privilege and turned into these rather childish young adults that they are actually in the play. We're told by Mr. Birling that, of course, people like Eric have money to spend, time to spare. And later on, he literally says to Eric, "You've been spoilt." There's also, as we see from very early on in the play, the links to the Croft family, who are an old country family, we're told, landed people, Sir George and Lady Croft. So it's quite clear right from the start that this is a family who are on the up socially, climbing the social ladder. So in some ways it's understandable that we would descriptively refer to them as upper class because they seem quite high up in society. Now if we're going to unpick what social class the Birlings are, we do need to think about Edwardian views of class. So here you can see three lists that basically run through how an Edwardian audience would have understood the social classes. And Priestley's playing on that by setting this play, of course, in 1912. Now, for the working class, they would have been associated universally with the idea of hard labour. The factory system is probably the most obvious example. They would have been paid low wages. There weren't the same sort of protections for workers that we have now. There's a sense in society of a rigid hierarchy. The working class are expected to know their place. Well, that's where they are, and they're supposed to stay there. There's also this really patronising view of them as being morally questionable, irresponsible, even criminal, as being lazy, as being drunken and unable to control themselves. At the same time, there is an understanding by people like Birling that they are still essential for society. So the whole social system only works if you've got a whole load of workers working hard, not earning very much, but making money for those above them, like the factory owners, like the Birlings and the Crofts. They're also quite patronised in many ways as a result of this paternalism and this prejudice. They're looked down on. And there's a sense also of things like these charities that we hear about. For example, the one that Mrs. Birling helps to run, which, although in theory helpful, are really simply reinforcing this idea of the working class as being weak, helpless, needy, irresponsible, morally questionable, and so on. What there's also, though, with the working class, and again Priestley's playing on this in terms of the time gap between 1912, when it's set, and him writing the play at the end of the Second World War, there's a growing awareness of social inequality and the dangers for the stability of the class system, of the workers working collectively, not for the benefit of the factory owners and the middle classes and the upper classes, but for their own benefit, the formation of trade unions and so on. And there's early signs we see of that through Eva Smith and her work in the factory. Now beyond that, there's the middle class. And the middle class essentially are the class of owners and managers and the professionals. Now at the upper end of the middle class, these people would have wealth acquired from industry or from professional work. Now these are not people with hereditary titles. They're not dukes and earls and barons and things. That's not the middle class. What they're seen as being is what's called nouveau riche, newly rich. The people who have recently acquired their money rather than inheriting it through centuries. They're aspirational. And quite often that's indicated through their mimicking of the upper classes. They try and go through the same routines, buy the same houses, eat the same food, drink the same drinks, go to the same places, do the things that are seen as being what the upper classes do. There's a real sense of respectability around them, not necessarily in terms of their behaviour, but in terms of how they desire to be seen. They have to be seen to be respectable publicly. And that's both moral respectability and also to be respected for their work ethic, for their enterprise. There's a really strict moral code at play in society surrounding the middle class, at least in terms of their public behaviour. But there's a real mismatch in terms of the way their public behaviour is viewed, having to be respectable, responsible, moral, and actually their private behaviour, where throughout the play it's riddled with this awareness that that's not who they are behind closed doors. And that's why Pretty takes out that fourth wall, opens that door, has the inspector going in and inspecting them in front of us. They're also socially conservative. So the middle class are very keen on preserving order, preserving structure, because it's a structure that benefits them. Importantly, though, they are also looked down on, patronised, even mocked by the aristocracy. They're not seen as their equals. They're not even seen as aspirational equals. They're looked down on. Now, the upper class, then, are the ones beyond that. And it's not just about wealth, although the upper class typically would be wealthy. What the upper class have is history, generations, centuries of being at the top of society. They have a heritage, a sense of their family names, their family crests, the inherited properties, the inherited wealth. They're associated with education in these top private schools. They're associated with land ownership, which would be inherited largely. They would have traditions and titles is really, really important here. These are the knights, the barons, the dukes, the earls, and so on. The people not quite the royal family, but the bit below that. They would have connections, relationships, and family links that interweave them within this broader upper class. They would be linked to public patronage of social causes. So they would go and be seen to be patrons of the arts, going to the opera, going to art galleries, paying for artists to work and so on. They would work for charities or support charities. And again, that public image of respectability that they need as well. They're quite firmly interwoven also with anything that's socially structured, like the military, like the church, like politics. And they're seen in these positions of power. And these positions of power quite often are dominated by the upper class or by some of the middle class who are creeping into these structures as well. But even beyond that, they're defined by their accent, by their manners, by their understanding of social behaviour, of etiquette, by their refinement, and their good taste. And that good taste going into things like, yes, food, drink, art, music, clothing, and all these sorts of things, which can both be a sign of inclusivity If you do those things, you must be one of us, but also exclusivity. If you can't quite do those things, you're not one of us. And that's where the middle class are still kept down, and the working class beyond them kept down even further. So it's true to say that for an Edwardian audience, social class, isn't just about money. It's about a whole range of things, including birth. And we hear about Gerald being a well-bred young man about town. He's someone who is born into the right family. About land. Now, the Birlings don't have land, but we are told that the Crofts are a country family, landed people, or at least Lady Croft was. It's also about social behaviour, manners. Now, Birling, we're told, has fairly easy manners, manners that maybe don't quite fit his aspirations of becoming upper class. Mrs. Birling even says to him at one point that he's not supposed to say such things. He's clearly someone who socially is a bit wrong-footed, not actually quite fitting in properly into what he wants to become. And it's about status. Lord Mayor, yep, Birling's got that. A sound, useful party man, knows the right people, does the right things. The social connections in terms of playing golf together. And also the way he draws on those connections with the inspector by referring to Gerald as the son of Sir George Croft. He's playing on the connections that he's got. So Birling's got some of the things, but not others. Now, a few things to be careful of that you often hear around social class, or people write about it and talk about it in the play. One is about golf. So people argue that golf and playing golf is a symbol of essentially bourgeois decadence, the indulgent middle class wasting time or wasting money. Now, to an extent, that one is correct. Golf is an expensive sport at the time. It is definitely exclusive. You've got to be on the inside to become part of a golf club, to play on these courses. And it is very much a masculine activity at the time. It's also a means of socializing, of connecting with the right people. And I'm making some invisible air inverted commas around right there. The people that you can use to access those parts of society, right? And that's why Birling boasts about playing golf. The other one is about alcohol. Now, this one actually is not correct. Now, the argument I come across sometimes is that the alcohol Birling offers the inspector, port or a little whiskey, shows his snobbery, that he's actually offering the inspector a working class drink. Now, that is nonsense, unfortunately. Port and whiskey serve different functions in terms of the rituals of the meal times. Port would have been served after the meal, at the end of the meal. You clear away all the dessert and stuff, and then you would have port. Whiskey as a drink would have been served in the drawing room afterwards as more of a private thing, like a part of male bonding. So all that Birling's doing is politely offering the inspector a drink, but it's also that symbol of his influence, that corruptive influence of people like him. So port and whiskey are drinks with different relevancies, served at different points in the evening. If nothing else, it would be bizarre for Birling to have a cheap drink on hand, just in case a random person he wants to patronise turns up at his house in the evening. It doesn't make sense. And do also notice that he buys port that mimics what Gerald's father drinks to make sure that he's doing the right things is seen as having taste, but it's inherited taste from someone else. Now, we've already essentially covered most of this, but just to pin this down, the case against. So why isn't it correct to say that the Birlings are an upper class family? Well, for one thing, social class in a family at this time is really taken from whoever the head of the household is. And in the Birling family, it's Mr. Birling, this patriarchal society. The father is at the top of the food chain. Now, Birling doesn't have a title. He's not Sir Birling. He wants to be. He doesn't have one yet. He's made his money through industry, that middle class aspect. He is provincial in his speech, we're told. They worked as hard in those days, he says. He's clearly someone who has worked his way up, earned his money in some ways, rather than this aristocratic inheritance. And that's that first, second generation issue. Now, Sheila and Eric might be able to access these upper class circles. Mr. Birling is very, very hard to break into. Mr. Birling is nouveau riche. Now, Mrs. Birling is, of course, her husband's social superior. She's married downwards. She comes from a better background than Mr. Birling, possibly upper class, presumably upper class. She corrects his behaviour, and she seems very, very finely tuned, finely aware of those class distinctions, hence her comments about social class. Now, Sheila's marriage is the thing that is going to connect the Birlings, these middle-class nouveau riche people, with the Crofts, these aristocratic landowners. And that's the Birling family using their children, the second generation, to help climb the social ladder. So the Birling family, ultimately, are what we call upper middle class. They're not upper class, they're right at the top of the middle class, but they've got aspirations of becoming middle class, and that's through Birling being awarded a title, becoming Sir Arthur Birling, and Sheila marrying into an upper class family, the Crofts. And that's a really important detail, that Birling is obsessed with being awarded a knighthood exactly because it grants him access to the upper class. That's respectability in a word. Now, while we're here, let's take this a little bit further for a few minutes. So, Mr. Birling is used in the play to symbolise capitalist self-interest. Now, we see that really openly from very early on. He openly brags about his business success, while also rejecting any sense of responsibility or care for his workers' welfare. So what Priestley's using him to do is to expose the flaws of the bourgeoisie, morally, socially, and so on, and the greed and the complacency of middle-class industrialists like him. Mrs. Birling also has a symbolic function. She represents the pretentiousness of these social class divisions. And in the play, we see her using her class connections not to aid the poor, but to reinforce her own prejudices, rather than really offering compassion or solidarity. And that is what the inspector and Priestley, through the inspector, criticises her for. Sheila and Eric are then part of this spoiled, privileged, infantilized, insulated younger generation, this corrupted second generation. And that's shown this ongoing cyclical corruption of the class system, which is propagated by Birling, Mrs. Birling, and those like them. But they do also, increasingly as the play goes on, represent the potential for change, for hope in society. So what Priestley is intending to show in the play is the moral failures of those assumed in society at the time to represent the pinnacle of respectability, and that's the Birlings and the Crofts. As Gerald says, we're respectable citizens and not criminals, and yet they're not. What they are in actual fact is people who encourage division, inequality, inequity, irresponsibility, and oppressive exploitation. Priestley's message, of course, is that that's not what we should be having. We are members of one body. We should be one society. So just to return then to our mythconception and the idea that the Birlings are an upper class family. It's wrong. Unfortunately, it is actually wrong. What the Birlings are is an upper middle class family. Now, Priestley deliberately constructs them in that way because that helps him to develop, to discuss, to riff on these ideas about equality, equity, the class system, capitalism, socialism, and all those other themes that he explores in the play. So what the Birlings are is an upper middle class family. So hopefully that's cleared that up, and hopefully that's been useful. As ever, do watch out for more of these videos appearing over the next few weeks, and they'll be covering all the literature texts that we do. But thanks for your time today.